Huh. I don't know if all of you are going to look, but the new one that I see, whoopsie, I just lost it. Let's see. I'm going to put that one, actually, I guess it won't go in chat because it's too long. But you might want to take a look at that one. It's called
down a little bit so I don't spill it.
For Me, My Mask. And it's quite extraordinary, really. Okay.
I'll put it over here.
All right.
Let's see what
So anyone else want to tell me how you are?
we got.
Sterling is here.
9 going with it over here. That's great, thank you. 9:41. We got 4 minutes.
Yes, we got 4 minutes to say how we are. How are you, Glenette?
Well, we're up to 16.
That's right. Well, that means everybody has 3 seconds. Or you can, sometimes I do this from 1 to 5, 5 being great and 1 being, yeah. How are you? Just put up fingers. 4. Somebody's got 4.
Look at
Somebody's 5. Bob is at 2. Ben is at 4. Anyone else? Just trying to take your temperature, really. From 1 to 5, how you're doing, 5 being super and 1 being not so good. Emmy.
Emmy. Yay.
Well, it's good to see you, Emmy Alexander. It's been a while. Emmy and I know each other from whole other experiences, so this was a beautiful surprise.
Great to see you.
Someday, like together and with a hug, yes.
Some button someplace.
Yeah.
Well, John, we got 3 minutes. What do you want to do with them?
What's that?
I
don't know.
John's audio is off.
Let's see.
no, I'm still here. Am I not?
I think Kirkendall, sorry.
Oh yeah, Kirkendall's audio is off.
Yeah.
Hi Pam.
Hi.
Not much to say.
Oh, hey Kirkendalls, it's nice to see you.
We're up to 17.
Is Charlie there?
Okay, we've got a crowd here.
Next to me.
I'm not sure.
Oh,
That doesn't include all the people that are on YouTube.
Yeah, which is, an interesting thought, because I don't actually know how many people are showing up or listening in, but I'm glad we had that opportunity to kind of stretch beyond our own little reality here.
Right now there are 5 in that row. They've been about 30 each week on that side.
Wow, okay then.
So is Pidge going to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge?
no.
God forbid not.
Background.
Yeah, I saw that.
So it looks like we still have few people coming in. Yeah. You all, by the way, can click on the upward caret that is next to stop video, and you can use that to change your name. So if there are 2 of you, you can put in both names, like Jane and Walt did, Ralph and Sandy did. So Evelyn, having your husband's name in there too would be wonderful and useful.
How do you do that?
You click on the upwards little caret that is next to stop video, and then, oops, wait a minute, sorry, you click on participants.
Okay.
And you should have an option to go to your name and then rename yourself. If you can't do it, don't worry about it. We'll be fine.
No.
You're just going to see everybody back.
So I'm going to help John mute everybody. Well, I guess I'm not going to do that. He's going to probably mute everybody when we get started. I think that usually Lynette opens us up, right, Lynette? Okay.
All right, let me do that.
Yeah, it's right there.
and Gwinnett.
Are you ready for me?
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. It's a delight to see all of your faces and so glad that you are joining us for this last session with Rabbi Barbara. I'd like to welcome you, if you're on YouTube, to the Davidson College Presbyterian Church Covenant class. It's been a real honor to be a part of this the last few days. There are a few housekeeping. I hope that all of you have, if you're on Zoom with us, that you found the mute button so that you can mute yourself when you are not speaking directly. And if you have a question and you're on Zoom, at the bottom of the screen, there's a chat button and you can ask questions, excuse me, that way, as well as in class. If you're on YouTube, you can ask your questions through the comments section and they'll be transferred over to Rabbi Barbara. I want to let you know about the Covenant class next week. Dr. Zamir, who's the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Davidson College, will discuss the history and traditions of Islam. This class will be held via Zoom. And if you're participating through YouTube Live and would like a Zoom link, you need to contact John Ryan by Wednesday. Let's see. Remember that it's important to keep your mute button on if you're on Zoom, if you're not speaking. And Tony, did you want to introduce our speaker?
Oh, did you unmute me?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Hi, my name's Tony Abbott, and I would like to take this opportunity not to introduce Rabbi Barbara, which I've done the last 2 weeks, but rather, since you all know who she is now, I would like to take this opportunity to thank her on behalf of the Covenant class for this extraordinary series. It's always a special gift to have Barbara with us, and it's an even larger gift this year under these extraordinary circumstances. So thank you so much for what you do for us, and thank you for your relationship to Davidson College Presbyterian Church. Rabbi Barbara Tita.
Thank you, Tony. How about a virtual hug? Right? The things we're missing. The ability to touch and hold each other. I want to start with a prayer and end with a prayer. And the prayer I want to start with is actually Moda'ani, though you'll hear me refer to it as Moda'ani. It can be said by male or female, and the verb changes Moda'ani if it's a woman. Moda'ani lefanecha ruach chai v'kayam shechachazata bi nishmati raba v'hemla v'emunatecha. I give thanks before you, eternal and living God, who returns my soul within me with mercy. Great is your faithfulness. May we be, in this third class session, open to the kind of gratitude that is neither naive nor by rote, but which is deeply felt and deeply understood and deeply expressed. With that in mind, before I share a poem that I intended to share with you, I want to give you the first stanza in chat of A New Lament and encourage you to go and look at this latest edition. Does it make you see I care? I just want us to think about what that means, because it was perfectly in tune with where I hope to take you today. I first want to share my screen with you and show you The prayer that I just read, translated into English, is actually only 12 words long in Hebrew. One of the things about English translation is that it cannot capture the brevity, the incredible compact way that Hebrew expresses a thought, an idea. This English translation, is 21 words long as opposed to 12. But I also want you to see this second poem by Gabriel Edward Hirsch, who lost his son at a young age. Look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. I want to begin there because Modeh Ani, this tiny little prayer of only 12 words, is understood in Jewish tradition to be a prayer that sets your holy intentions for the day. Modeh Ani is there to remind us, acknowledge the gift of life. Say these 12 words before you say anything else. Thank God for God's mercy and compassion. And then prepare to live intentionally. Live a day of intention, right? Of purpose, of meaning. So you might ask, well, okay, what's the problem? Why is this a problem, Rabbi Barbara, to have these 12 words begin your day? Why could this be a challenge? And I want to ask any of you, do you know what it is like to wake up in pain? In physical pain. You wake up and you feel pain. Okay, Evelyn raised her hand. Do you know what it is like to wake up in grief and sorrow and mourning, that kind of emotional pain? How many of you know what it's like, have experienced waking up that way? How many of you know what it's like to wake up in fear for somebody else? I could go on and on, right? Gabriel Hirsch is writing about the loss of his child. That is the bag of cement that he has to shoulder every single day. What happens when you are the witness to someone who has died because they got killed in a drunk driving accident? What happens if you yourself suffer from some kind of suicidal depression? At the beginning of this series, I believe I mentioned to you all that I had a student who was suffering from severe depression, who has twice served in war in Afghanistan, who came home only to find that her best friend himself committed suicide because he couldn't handle what he'd seen and experienced. She wakes up every single day with that cement bag on her shoulder. And every single day, she says, she has to fight in order to live. So you have to ask this question, can you just say, all right, well, is it even possible to say this prayer of gratitude, Modeh Ani, just simply and gratefully, without being mindful of the fragility of our friends and our neighbors and the world? Can you say Modeh Ani and just say, oh, thank you, God, for giving me my life back, right? I've got a personal victory over death this morning. Thank you, God. Can you do that in a world that is filled with lament and not just your own? In a world in which lamentations is a daily reality for so many people around the world, and now is a daily reality that we ourselves struggle with in our isolation, our confusion, and even our despair. Last week, I mentioned to you, so strange, this prayer of gratitude is actually connected to the book of Lamentations. These 12 words have embedded in them two, Rabba ve'emunatecha. Rabba ve'emunatecha. They're the final words of the prayer. And they mean, ample is your grace. And the rabbis say, before you say these words, and you may not remember, but I paused before I said these words. I said, Behemla, then I paused. And then I said, Rabba, ve'emunatecha. I gave you a long pause. The rabbis say you should pause. And if you don't know where these words come from, you might not know, well, why are they telling me to pause before saying ample is your grace? Why? Why is that necessary? And I think it's necessary because these words come from Lamentations, the 3rd chapter of Lamentations. And you may remember that the first week we spoke so long and with such intensity about daughter Zion and her initial despair and then her rage, the way she brings God to account for murdering his own children. And then we spoke about chapter 3 and the Gever, the strong man, going through this cycle of emotions where first he accuses God, then he pleads with God, then he represents his community and asks, where are you? Because as we know, God never answers in all these 5 books of Lamentations. And we spoke of Lamentations 4 and 5, and the way that here again, there is this question, where are you? What has happened to us? How can we possibly explain the despair, the terror that we're experiencing? And from this prayer, this book of prayers, of supplications, of laments, come these 2 words that we're supposed to say every single day when we wake up. So first you might ask me, well, come on, Rabbi Barbara, right? Ample is your grace. You can find those words elsewhere, and they're just generic words, and they're not connected. But you tell me, I'm just curious, how many times your ministers sermonize and connect, for example, Genesis 2:17 with a text from Psalms? Don't eat of that tree. If you do, you'll die. And you'll die on that day that you eat of it. And then your minister will tell you, oh, well, but a day for God is how long? Anyone know? According to Psalms, how long is one day for God? Does anyone know the answer to that one? Yay, Ralph and Sandy.
1,000 years.
1,000 years. And so your minister will say, Adam, who lived just shy of 1,000 years old, God was just saying, you're going to die on one of my days, not one of your days, right? Like, that's what's going on. Now, honestly, if I take off this hat and I put on my historian's hat, I'll say, really? The writer of Genesis 2 and 3 knew not the writer of Psalms, and there's no evidence that the writer of Genesis 2, 3, those chapters, had the same idea that there was God and God's day of 1,000 years. There's no evidence. You're tying things together that are not related. But both our traditions do that all the time. We use one text to explain another text, do we not? We refer to other places where the same words are found. We say that our narratives, our legends, our stories, our tales are intertwinable parts of a whole corpus of human literature that helps us explain the nature of God and the nature of humanity. Do we not? Anyone disagree with me on that? Because I'll tell you, that's like the Jewish playground. The Jewish playground is the rabbis doing this place, this verse, and that verse, and putting them together, right? We discover that the only 2 times when somebody hides anybody in exactly one particular verb that you'll find in Exodus is when Yocheved hides her son, or when Rahab hides the slaves, right? Only there is that word used the same way. Well, what's going on? Rahab is given to us as kind of a woman who births the saviors of Israel, the spies who are going to help in the conquering story, the way Yocheved births the Savior of Israel, who frees the Israelites from Egypt. So I'm making my case that these two words from Lamentations are there absolutely deliberately. They proclaim God's faithful redemption, or at least the longing for that faithful redemption. But I want you to take a look, if you will, with me. Where do we find those words? So I'm going to share my screen again. Hold on, got the wrong one. There we go. And we're going to move on. This is the place in chapter 3 where you will find ample is your grace. Is there anyone who wants to read? John, you want to read this text for us?
He has filled me with bitterness, sated me with wormwood. He has broken my teeth on gravel, has ground me into the dust. My life was bereft of peace. I forgot what happiness was. I thought my strength and hope had perished before the Lord. To recall my distress and my misery was wormwood and poison. Whenever I thought of them, I was bowed low. But this I do, I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The kindness of the Lord has not ended. His mercies are not spent. They are renewed every morning. Ample is your grace.
Okay. So I would like you to look closely at this. It looks like we have, so to speak, a happy ending here. That may appear to be the case with this text, but let's look more deeply. What do you see going on for the Gever, the strong man, in this passage here? How do you read what the speaker is doing, what the strong man is saying? And because I can't see all of you at the same time, you'll have to, I won't be able to call on you. You'll just have to unmute and speak, and then the grid will show me who it is. And take a close look at those words. I forgot what happiness was.
So Rabbi Barbara, can you hear me?
I can, George.
I have the Revised Standard Version. Mine doesn't say ample is your grace.
Well, I'm going to have to apologize for the very reason, or maybe I won't apologize, that I said to Tony, no, the phrase that you are claiming is a question is not a question in the Hebrew. I chose to use a translation of the Hebrew that has does not have the same valence as the New Revised Standard does. So this is actually coming from a Jewish translation.
Okay. Well, it does use the words great is thy faithfulness.
Yes, I can imagine that you can think about it in that way, George. That's not an outrageous way to read it. Just ample is your grace is a more literal translation of the Hebrew. Tony, did I see your hand? You'll have to unmute, Tony. Okay, whoops. I went and unmuted you, and then somebody else muted you, probably John. All right, Tony, go ahead.
It means the same thing, doesn't it?
As I said, that's there. You don't have a really widely different outcome in the translation. There are times when you really do, as we saw in the example you gave last week, where the translator interjected a question where there's no sign of a question actually being asked, right? But here, I think you can, great is your faithfulness, ample is your grace. Those are legitimate, equal valences for the translation, and that's fine. But what I'm asking you to do is actually to look at the voice of the persona here, the Gever of the strong man, and to see what you see happening. Pam, I think I saw your hand.
Looks to me like in the beginning, oops, now it says I'm muted and I can't read the text. Okay. Well, it
We
says
hear you.
he's really, and God has sent him hard times. He has filled me with bitterness. He has seated me. He has broken my teeth. He has ground me. And then the rest of the poem seems to be what goes on in his mind. And so then, but this I do call to mind, therefore I have hope. So it's in memory. It may not be because he finds this grace right now, but he remembers it's happened in the past, and so he trusts it's going to happen in the future.
That was brilliant, Pam. That was really brilliant. This do I call to mind. It's not God who appears here and says, I'll take you back, everything's going to be okay. The speaker is doing some important work to find his way out of despair. Any other comments about that? Very nice, Pam. Thank you. Any thoughts about this? A personal question now. Have any of you had to bring yourself out of despair when you felt so isolated and alone that you weren't even sure that God could help you? Have any of you ever been in that place? Isolated even from God or prayer? I know that's a very hard question because it's hard to admit that kind of low place.
I haven't, but I witnessed my sister when her 25-year-old son died, and it took her years to come out of the depths of despair.
And you would understand that, Jane, right?
Yes, yes.
I believe I told you all the story at some point in this series of the woman who called me after I'd written about the death of my sister in Cabarrus Neighbors, where I used to work as a columnist. And she told me that she kept going to church after the death of her daughter, also in her early 40s. And people kept telling her she was angry at God because she was still mourning her daughter. And I said on the phone, when will you not mourn your daughter? And you'll carry that grief to your grave. And the only difference that you may feel is the extent to which the wound is bleeding and open, or the wound is closed and scarred over. And even then, can the memory or a picture of your daughter as a child, can any piece of your own heart and soul and experience carrying her, raising her and loving her, can that reopen the wound? Of course it can.
Mm-hmm.
What is more horrible than losing a child? I don't know. Do any of the rest of you have a sense of anyone you've known who has been in this kind of place, this kind of despair, has had to call themselves out, not because they received an answer from God, but because they hoped for an answer from God?
Could even write about it.
So I think one of the things I want to say to you is that the gift of this text is an extraordinary gift of compassion. And that gift of compassion is so that you, yourselves, as believers, can hear Jane's sister, can permit Jane's sister her anguish and her sorrow. Jane's sister is all around you. People who suffer from severe depression and cannot see their way out are all around you. And if we do not have a text like this, if we don't have a place in our shared texts that permit us to see that sometimes our grief, our sorrow, our mourning, and our lament can be so awful that we don't know how to get out, because we can't hear anything but our own pain, and that is permissible, understandable. I must tell you all that when I wrote the piece on Modeh Ani that I am describing to you today, that was during a period in which one of my most lively, amazing, extraordinary students in 4 decades, a girl from a rural North Carolina mountain area, a girl who grew up so poor that the vinyl in the house was cracked. And I mean, I've seen where she lived. She used to joke about it. We were poor, she would say to me. And this amazing, extraordinary young girl called me in December of 1 year before I was writing this piece to tell me she had 3rd stage colon cancer. And to come back and into my house and ask me if I would do her funeral. She was the same age as my son, 23. And I know that during the time that I walked alongside her to say, ample is your grace, was difficult for me. To say that prayer every morning was painful for me. So I think this text, in which the speaker is physically and psychically crushed and does not know what happiness is, and to remember even his happiness is so difficult, that when he recalls his distress and his misery, he faces nothing but anguish. And yet he hopes, as Jan said, in the phrase that will later close Modeh Ani, ample is your grace. So why am I so emphasizing the source, the place where this text comes from? Because Lamentations is a text that doesn't blindly trust. It names and describes absolute, utter desolation, both physical and spiritual. Remember, this is the man who says, I was walled in, I was crushed. Remember, daughter Zion, he threw me back. He put fire in my bones, right? The speaker here, nevertheless, is praying for redemption and for peace and for purpose and for God. The author of Modeh Ani has ended a prayer of gratitude with the plea of a desperate person whose life is surrounded by death. Did everybody follow me there? Everybody get that? The ending of the prayer of gratitude, I'll just repeat that, is a plea of a desperate person whose life is surrounded by death. The Catholic theologian Kathleen O'Connor, I strongly, by the way, recommend this book if any of you haven't read it, called The Abusing God, the book she wrote about Lamentations. She says, Lamentations marks out the place of ruptured life. It marks the place of ruptured life, where the old story fails and a new one has yet to appear. When Jane's sister lost her 25-year-old son, the old story failed. For years, there was no new story for her. The old story simply failed. And we need to give permission for people to take their own time through their own grief, through their own lament, and not force them into a new story that has not yet emerged for them. That is also true of us at this time. So what is the new story? What is the news story that needs to appear? Did I tell you that the day that I did Sarah's funeral, the day that I performed a funeral at the mountain stream next to the broken down homestead she lived in, the day we distribute her ashes in that stream, a day when every piece of that funeral was a way to experience an internal disruption and pain that was so awful that trying to be there for her family was the most challenging thing I've ever done. And on that day, our son took a young girl out on a date. I buried Sarah on the day that Serafina entered our lives in a very serious way. She is now my daughter-in-law. I had no idea that there was a new story unfolding that day. There's also a story that unfolds when we permit ourselves to lament. Have any of you ever accompanied somebody in their last months? Like really accompanied them? Have any of you ever done that? So I see Jan has. Anyone else? Ah, I see others have. Tell me if this resonates for you. The people you accompany on their last path know how precious their lives are. And that is not a cliche. When you realize the imminence of the end of your life, you know that cruelty has no place in this world. And that awareness is not naive. Death is actually our teacher. I'm sure you've seen that in A Life Left to Live, miracles of reconciliation occur. A conversation of 10 minutes becomes a legacy for a lifetime. That is not the stuff of Hallmark cards or maudlin movies. This is about the larger narrative of human life and the divine grace that created it. When you place yourself before the fragility of life, the specific sunset you see, the deep familiarity of the voice of someone beloved to you, the presence of life eternal becomes acute. Does it not? And are we not in this place of COVID-19, in this place of fear and lamentation and isolation? Sometimes experiencing a moment when we go outside and look at the sky, at the green around us, at the beloved face of someone whose life is so important to us, and we realize the fragility of the world in a way that we would not have been conscious of walking out of our doors last December or November or October or September. We are now all being asked to look at the light that shines through the leaf of the gumball tree and to be grateful. for what we do have, which even in this time is rich. So I think the lesson of Modeh Ani and the lesson of its connection to Lamentations is to make us mature and conscious adults. Take those 12 words, place yourself deliberately before God, and without reservations, in the light of both death and life, you can inhabit eternity and know you have a place in it. We are all living in the company of death now. And we are permitted, remember the words of the first week? I'll read them again for you. To mourn, to grieve, to bemoan, to deplore, regret, bewail, cry, howl, wail, weep, sob, sorrow. Those were all the words, synonyms for lament. We're permitted to lament. And Modeh Ani is not asking us to proclaim some kind of childish victory. We woke up, we're still alive. It's asking us to live a life that is conscious of the fragility of all life. To thank God for the grace that's given birth to the miracle of all existence. Its words are no simple recitation of some triumph of life at all. But really those words coming from Lamentations 2 are aware of life's fragility. And if you know life's fragility, you know grace and purpose in a broken and fragile world. You know purpose in a broken and fragile world. And what is that purpose? To love each other, to love the world, and to love God. And for those reasons, no matter the morning, and even when I find it hard, I say, Modeh Ani lefanecha, ruach chai v'kayam shechachazata bi nishmati, raba behemla ve'emunatecha. I give thanks before you, eternal and living God, who returns my soul to me with mercy. Ample is your grace. We're at the end of 3 weeks, and I wanted to give you plenty of time to speak to me this time about what you've learned, about what has come through for you, about what you needed from the Book of Lamentations and what you've taken away. So I'd like to have a time where we really have a conversation now. Tony.
It occurs to me, and I thought about this last week also, that this message of hope and grace is in the middle of the book, not at the end. And that if chapter 3 were the last chapter and this were the end of the book, it would be very different from this being in the middle, because the chapters 4 and 5, are much darker than chapter 3. I'm wondering if the person who put the book together thought about that, put this chapter 3 in the middle.
Do you remember maybe when I said to you, and I'm going to share my screen again. Hold on one second so that we can look at how this text actually ends. So hold on one second. Let's take a look at what do we see in the very last verses, right? I made a point of this last week. Take us back, Yud-He-Vav-He, to yourself. Let us come back, renew our days of old. If it had ended at that verse, right, it would have been a different narrative than we end here. For truly you have rejected us. This is where Tony had a translation that had, "Have you rejected us?" Where the Hebrew is really pretty seriously clear. You've rejected us. You have bitterly raged against us. And this "take us back, O Lord, to yourself, let us come back, renew the days of old," which is a repetition of this verse, is written here in the Hebrew again, purely because the rabbis couldn't take the book ending with the "bitterly raged against us," right? That they absolutely refused to do that. And so they extracted the verse before it and put it at the very end. Remember, I asked you, did your texts do that? I think the way your texts translations have done that is to create a question, so it won't be so bad. The way Jewish tradition has done it is to repeat the "Hashivenu Adonai" right here. "Take us back, O Lord." So, question that is being asked here, is that deliberate? What do the rest of you think before I answer? Was that a deliberate choice of the redactor who put these 5 poems together, remembering that these 5 poems are likely written by 5 different authors, and that there were likely many, many more laments marking the tragedy of the destruction of the temple, out of which this collection was put together? So that seems to suggest that somebody's thinking pretty hard about the order, about the choice, all those things. So thoughts about that? Yes, Jane?
Utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. We have to make the decision to live our lives in the way of God and loving our neighbors. And if we don't do that, then he is going to reject us.
Interesting. Okay, let's think about that. On the one hand, Jane, I'd say all through Hebrew Bible, I know there was a class we had a couple of years back where I said to you, all through Hebrew Bible, there's always the chance of return. You can always come back. God never shuts that off. And the only time that we get close to shutting it off entirely is either in Lamentations, where God just doesn't answer, or in Isaiah, where God turns God's face away, because, as just in line with what Jane said, God can't stand what human beings are doing, right?
Yes.
This was the theology, Jane, that came out of the Holocaust, right? God couldn't stand what human beings were doing, and God turned God's face away, right? But I also said to you, what is God always doing? Arms are always outstretched. Remember the story I told you, Wer kommt in meine Arme, right? The German game that German parents play with their children. They spread their arms real wide and they say, "Who's coming in my arms?" And the child runs squealing into the arms of the parent. I think I told you that there was a story in the newspaper about a young woman who was playing this with her son, and a young man basically did that to her. "Wer kommt in meine Arme?" jokingly, right? So that she would run into his. But I also told you that's what God does. "Wer kommt in meine Arme?" Who's coming into my arms? They're always open, right? And yet, as Jane points out, maybe there is a place where God turns away from what we do. Can't take it. Goes off to sorrow and weep over our genocides, over our destruction of the planet, over the way that we have been cruel, century upon century, millennia onwards. Other learnings or thoughts about the ending of Lamentations, about the deliberate way in which we end with a question, that is in our own minds. How do we come out of this place with a God who's not answering? And yet hope. Charles.
Morning. Let's see. Am I muted? No.
Nope, I unmuted you.
Oh, thank you. One thing you've done for me, and thank you for it, is to make me relook at the old favorite Protestant hymn called "Great is My Faithfulness." And it seems to me as if you give us a different way of looking at the way I have, obviously mistakenly, maybe, certainly, taken this hymn. I've looked at it as a sort of soft piety, but it's not that at all. Now that I read the words to it just now, in the light of what you told us, I mean, do you know what you know the hymn I'm talking about?
I do.
What
And
do you
I
think
love
of
your
it?
word
Look,
soft piety.
yeah, I mean, it's a suspicious kind of piety, always seemed that way. And yet,
Oh, he froze.
I'm sorry, I can't, it seems to me to be sort of too equal-sided. It doesn't give, it hasn't, for me, just, I mean, I don't mean to bemoan about a criticism of this hymn, but for me, it doesn't give the kind of depth, contextual depth of what human tragedy is experienced like. I don't know.
I absolutely hear you, right? It's one of the things that happens for my own students is they'll come to the university 18, 19, right? And at this point in their lives, they will experience their first real awful tragedies, right? Either the death of a friend or the death of a relative. Something will go terribly wrong. And if they have been told all their lives, a soft piety is what you must express, a piety that neither recognizes the deep fragility of life or the pain of loss of life, how deep that pain goes, it's a crisis for them.
Yeah.
They're in crisis. And it is, I can tell you, I teach Lamentations at UNC Charlotte once every couple of years, if not more. And every single time I teach it, there's a student who comes to me and says, I wish I'd known, right? There's a student, I can tell you stories of the student who read Lamentations the semester. His cousin was shot by gang violence, a cousin who was like a brother to him, and he didn't know where God was. I can tell you stories of the military vet, the veteran who said to us in class one day, imagine an 8 to 10-year-old child coming at you strapped with stuff around his middle and 500 guns going off at the same time. Where is God in all that? As that child is blown to smithereens, right? We cannot afford to have a soft piety in this world, or we will never remake it. We will never encounter and contend with the cruelty and the pain that human beings inflict, nor will we work to change that with a soft piety. There, Jane, is the answer to your question, right? How is it that we really become channels for God in real ways, not easy ways, but real ways? It's much more demanding. It's much harder. It's much harder.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Charles. I'm so with you on this. Any other thoughts and learning? Susan, do I see your hand? Yeah.
Yes. Going back to Tony's question about the placement of this hopeful section in 3, what it says to me is this is really the way life is, that we are going to have, life is not always going to have a happy ending. And, you know, we all close out in, you know, in joy and peace and tranquility. But life, we have joys. We certainly have times of deep and desperate sorrow and struggle. And it seems to me that a word of hope that comes in the midst of those times have the most impact. And you know, even in the ending of this book, where we ask for God to take us back, or that we may be restored, in my translation, is a continued and ongoing plea in our life as we live life in its many ups and downs. So to me, I think the placement probably was a deliberate placement in the midst of our struggles, not to forget that God is there every morning and his grace is ample for our needs for that day.
So it's interesting, right? Because one thing, Susan, I want to point out or reiterate what Pam also said, right? The text that we find this hope is, therefore I have hope, right? That the kindness of the Lord has not ended. So this isn't even conviction or certainty, it's hope, right? It's hope in the middle of a desperate time. There is no clear certainty of anything. This is the most destabilized moment of our scriptures. And the reason I feel it's a gift is because knowing that we can all be in a place that is that destabilized, you know, there is such a thing as Auschwitz. There is such a thing as Rwanda. There were the Khmer Rouge. There are real world times when human beings on the border, captured in cages, you know, you have to ask yourself, is there a place that I can imagine that is so destabilized that all I have is hope that God will answer me? And I think acknowledging that that destabilized place exists in this world is actually a call for us to create a world in which that would not be a hope, but that would be certainty. And the way we do that is actually by embodying and being God. In that sense, right? Being godly, being serious about how we create the world. That's how we actually make sure that isn't just a hope that God will be there, but a certainty, because we all are channels for that love, or can be. We are all channels for creating the world in which no Auschwitz could exist, no Rwanda could exist, no Khmer Rouge could exist, no children are in cages, no people have to fear for their lives, no people have to hunger. No people have to be in a world where right now they can't get the medical care they need, because to try and find it would mean to be arrested. That's life in COVID-19 for some. So I hear you, that's in the middle. That hope is there. But what is the charge of this text? The charge of this text is a very serious one, and it lies on all of us. How do we make the world? And how do we make the world safe for God? There's a whole lot of temple ritual around making God's house pure for God, possible for God, available for God to be able to enter that house and be with us. What is our work? I think Lamentations calls us to ask that question. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Some other thoughts? Pam. Hold on, let me unmute you. Go ahead.
A poem comes to mind, Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world.
Yeah, Tikkun Olam.
Is that how you say it? Okay.
That is how you say it, Tikkun Olam. I'll put it in chat So
Yeah.
you know what that word those words
Okay.
are, and I will translate them for you. So tikkun means to heal.
Yeah.
To make a tikkun is to make a healing.
Yeah.
Olam has 3 different meanings. It means the material world that we are living on. So tikkun olam, heal the world, the earth. Tikkun olam, olam can also mean the universe, the eternal, right? We say God is ruler, leolam va'ed, for all of eternity. So it can be the universal space of eternity. And the last meaning of olam, which is really an important one people forget to mention, is secret, mysterious, unknown. What is the unknown healing that we must discover, that we must do? What is the tikkun olam for the world, for the universe, for eternity? What is the secret healing that we ourselves must find, discover, and apply to this broken world? Yes, Pam, tikkun olam. What did you
And
want to
so-
say about it?
And so, in that, as I remember it, the world is broken into pieces, and we are those fragments. We are those remnants, and we repair the world by being love. And so that
The
seems,
Lurianic Kabbalah you're referring to is, right, like this idea that there's this disaster at the beginning, at the first creation, and the shards of light that God wants to put into the vessel, right, literally break the vessel. And so this vessel is the brokenness of the world, and that for the Jewish theology there, it is your task all your life long to go looking for those shards and to create the tikkun that it will help unify the world in love. So one of the most challenging shards that we face is the damage we've done to this planet, right? Or another one, the damage we do to other human beings by not understanding how privileged we are in this room as white people, and therefore not understanding the suffering and the pain of people of color, right? Those would all be expressions of that brokenness, the shards. And yes, indeed, we also are all broken, right? And so we have to heal even the brokenness in ourselves. And how do we do any of that? I mean, like, this is the easy answer on that level. It's all done with love. On that level, not complicated. Both our traditions make that pretty clear, right? Love your neighbors, yourself, however hard that is, and not the convenient, easy neighbor, right? Figure out who's hard for you to love.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
go ahead.
And I'm sorry it says Jansen on there. That's the computer. This is Eric and Ginger. Haven't figured out how to do that yet, but I will. I was just thinking about, you know, the sorrow that you feel in a death. And when my mother passed, I was 8.5 months pregnant. And so that love that came into our life really helped with the healing process, the grieving process. And then when my father died, many years later, like 35 years later, I guess, our daughter-in-law was pregnant and 2 weeks later gave birth. So twice we've had that love come so soon after tragedy.
An extraordinary reminder, right? For me, it still is, to my mind, extraordinary that the day I did the hardest funeral of my life and vowed I was never going to do such a funeral again, for one Sarah, another Sarah shows up. I still haven't figured that one out. Yeah. Well, I'd like to close, my friends, with a prayer. I'd like to ask us all in this room to recall to mind our hope. The kindness of God has not ended, and God's mercies are not spent. They are renewed every morning. Ample is God's grace. Help us to hope, and to hope with clarity and conviction. Help us to wake every day knowing the fragility of your created world and being ever so grateful for it, that we are inspired to take care of it and each other with love. May we say amen.
Hey, Barbara, Rabbi Barbara.
Yes.
Will you send me the resources that you used today, and I will send them out to the class? We had somebody ask for the prayer.
The prayer and the poems? Absolutely.
And
I will do that.
As a PDF this afternoon, so people have access to read those.
Can do.
Thank you.
I hope to see you all in 1 year in that room in the yellow building where the driveway goes way down like that. I hope to see you all there. Please stay well and stay safe.
Spring is what's mind blowing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
very much.
Be well all.